In this lecture video, I'm going to be looking at what Iris Marion Young calls the politics of difference. The beginning question is whether liberation from systems of domination and oppression is achieved through a transcendence of group difference, which she calls assimilation, or in other words, is the best way to overcome injustice by getting rid of all differences among all groups. So she gives a kind of background or historical narrative here, where tradition, she says, decreed that law and social norms defined rights, privileges, and obligations differently for different groups, distinguished by characteristics of sex, race, class, or occupation. So we can think of, feudal era, ancient, conservative, aristocratic societies. Liberal Enlightenment, then, came to argue that the state and law should express rights only in universal terms applied equally to all, not, more rights for the king, less for the serfs, and so on. So differences among persons and groups should be a purely accidental and private matter. What's interesting is that Young argues, actually, the best way to overcome domination and oppression is through an egalitarian politics of difference that argues that justice sometimes requires different treatment for oppressed or disadvantaged groups. That sometimes a kind of, shall we say, like a race-blind approach can actually end up perpetuating forms of racism. What's important is how she thinks of difference is more fluidly and relational, as a product of social processes, not some kind of innate status that someone is born with, and that is inherently different, whether by their sex, race, or class, or whatever else. She offers Richard Wasserstrom as the kind of key person arguing in favor of what she calls this assimilationist approach. And he offers 3 reasons why the assimilationist approach is the correct one to address injustice. First, the assimilationist ideal exposes the arbitrariness of group-based social distinctions which are thought natural and necessary. That it can say, look, there's no reason why there should be greater rights for white people and less rights for black people. It's entirely arbitrary. They're all human beings and and should receive then equal respect under the law. Secondly, the assimilationist ideal presents a clear and unambiguous standard of equality and justice, that everyone should be morally equal, everyone should be politically equal, everyone should be legally equal. There's no kind of arbitrariness based on myth or just tradition as to why we should follow something, as to why some people should have more rights than others. It's very clear and it's easy to enforce. Finally, the third reason, the assimilationist ideal maximizes choice. If you treat everyone equally, then you enable everyone to pursue their own ideals in life. So this is the kind of like basic liberal freedom of choice, that if you have everyone that is equal under the eyes of the law, or everyone is treated equally, then whatever differences do occur are through people's own voluntary decisions. But whether liberation movements should pursue what she calls this assimilation-based approach has been disputed historically, and she offers 2 different examples of this. So first, in the case of the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So she says, not long after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, many white and black supporters of the black civil rights movement were surprised, confused, and angered by the emergence of the Black Power movement. Black Power advocates criticized the integrationist goal and reliance on the support of white liberals that characterized the civil rights movement. They encouraged blacks to break their alliance with whites and assert the specificity of their own culture, political organization, and goals. Instead of integration, they encouraged blacks to seek economic and political empowerment in their separate neighborhoods. Since the late 1960s, many blacks have claimed that the integration successes of the civil rights movement have had the effect of dismantling the basis of black organized social and economic institutions, at least as much as they have lessened black-white animosity and opened doors of opportunity. While some individual blacks may be better off than they would have been if these changes had not occurred, of this, changes in terms of this assimilationist approach, as a group, she argues, blacks are no better off and may be worse off because the blacks who have succeeded in assimilating into the American middle class no longer associate as closely with lower class blacks. So even, for example, in the case of a kind of assimilationist approach to race, you still have the issue of, well, okay, let's say if we have blacks as a group treated equally as whites, that doesn't undo the problem of class dynamics within the greater black social identity. While much black politics has questioned the ideal of assimilation in economic and political terms, the past 20 years have also seen the assertion and celebration by blacks of a distant Afro-American culture, both as a recovery and reevaluation of an Afro-American history and in the creation of new cultural forms. The slogan, "Black is beautiful," pierced American consciousness, deeply unsettling the received body aesthetic, which I argued in Chapter 5, continues to be a powerful reproducer of racism. Afro-American hairstyles pronounce themselves differently stylish, not less stylish. Linguistic theorists asserted that black English is English differently constructed, not bad English. And black poets and novelists exploited and explored its particular nuances. So we have these particular cases of where we have a kind of difference in how to approach a liberatory movement. In the case of the civil rights movement, it's equal rights for all, right? Black individuals as a group should be treated the same as white individuals. But we also have in the Black Power movement this emphasis on actually there's something unique, there's something good to be celebrated by being black. So in the case of Black Beauty, or we can even think of in movements against injustice with the slogan Black Lives Matter, right? That it's not just that, all lives matter, that everybody should be treated equally, but to say, look, there's specific instances where black individuals are being treated as if their lives value less compared to white individuals, so black lives should matter too, but the slogan is focused on black, not all. She also looks at the case of feminist movements, comparing the humanist feminism with what she calls feminist separatism. So here she says, the women's movement has also generated its own versions of a politics of difference. Humanist feminism, which predominated in the 19th century and in the contemporary women's movement until the late 1970s, finds in any assertion of difference between women and men only a legacy of female oppression and an ideology to legitimate continued exclusion of women from socially valued human activity. Humanist feminism is thus analogous to an ideal of assimilation and identifying sexual equality with gender blindness, with measuring women and men according to the same standards, and treating them in the same way. Indeed, for many feminists, androgyny names the ideal of sexual liberation, a society in which gender difference itself would be eliminated. Given the strength and plausibility of this vision of sexual equality, it was confusing when feminists too began taking the turn to difference, asserting the positivity and specificity of female experience and values. Feminist separatism, on the other hand, right, was the earliest expression of such gynocentric feminism. Feminist separatism rejected wholly or partly the goal of entering the male-dominated world, because it requires playing according to rules that men have made and that have been used against women, and because trying to measure up to male-defined standards inevitably involves accommodating or pleasing the men who continue to dominate socially valued institutions and activities. Separatism promoted the empowerment of women through self-organization, the creation of separate and safe spaces where women could share and analyze their experiences, voice their anger, play with and create bonds with one another, and develop new and better institutions and practices. Most elements of the contemporary women's movement have been separatist to some degree. Separatists seeking to live as much of their lives as possible in women-only institutions were largely responsible for the creation of women's culture that burst forth all over the United States by the mid-1970s and continues to claim the loyalty of millions of women in the form of music, poetry, spirituality, literature, celebrations, festivals, and dances. Whether drawing on images of Amazonian grandeur, recovering and revaluing traditional women's arts like quilting and weaving, or inventing new rituals based on medieval witchcraft, the development of such expressions of women's culture gave many feminists images of a female-centered beauty and strength entirely outside capitalist patriarchal definitions of feminine pulchritude. The separatist impulse also fostered the development of the many autonomous women's institutions and services that have concretely improved the lives of many women, whether feminists or not, such as health clinics, battered women's shelters, rape crisis centers, and women's coffee houses and bookstores. So here we can see that she's arguing that emancipatory movements asserting a positive sense of group difference offer a different ideal of liberation. Not liberation in everyone being treated the same, but liberation through the ideal of what she calls democratic cultural pluralism. She says, in this vision, the good society does not eliminate or transcend group difference. Rather, there is equality among socially and culturally differentiated groups who mutually respect one another and affirm one another in their differences. So they positively recognize the differences among individuals, the kind of perspectives that they bring, in a sense, to the table. But they don't try to make everyone the same. They respect that difference through affirmation. Now the question arises, is a society without group differences even possible or desirable? Is a race or sex-blind society possible or desirable? And to this, Young says that attachment to specific traditions, practices, language, and other culturally specific forms is a crucial aspect of social existence, that we do, even if only unconsciously, cling to these differences, how we think of ourselves, how we define ourselves. That people do not usually give up their social group identifications even when they are oppressed. So it's not possible to have a society without group differences because of maybe even only psychological characteristics. She also thinks it's not desirable because people want to have a positive sense of what makes them different from others, not to deny that difference. So she argues ignoring difference has oppressive consequences in three respects. The first is blindness to difference disadvantages groups whose experience, culture, and socialized capacities differ from those of privileged groups. She says assimilation always implies coming into the game after it has already begun, after the rules and standards have already been set, and having to prove oneself according to those rules and standards. So you can imagine, for example, let's say in the case of chattel slavery in the United States being undone, well, there's going to be a kind of difference in, let's just say, capital resources between, the white kind of social bodies compared to the black social body. And saying, well, now everybody is treated equal under the law doesn't take into account that, well, what people are able to do, even if everyone's treated equal, are different because of historical circumstances like slavery that can have future-oriented effects. Secondly, the ideal of a universal humanity without social group differences allows privileged groups to ignore their own group specificity. She says, blindness to differences perpetuates cultural imperialism by allowing norms expressing the point of view and experience of privileged groups to appear neutral and universal. So we can think of this case in maybe, let's say, music, and this idea that, well, white music groups are just kind of neutrally considered, like the best, or the kind of what American music is, for example. Not taking into account maybe different experiences, different kinds of knowledge, and celebration of different black artists or Latino artists or female artists that might also just as much be representative of American tradition, of American excellence. So you have that dominant group prior to, right, social equality. There's already been a history then of celebration of certain things that are created by that dominant group. Then you implement social equality. Well, what's going to happen? Well, those who perhaps have had more material resources and things like that, that in that sense have exceeded, they're going to have this kind of neutral view that, like, that's the ideal, that's the standard, which everyone else should live up to. So in a way, you end up perpetuating a kind of difference, but a difference through a kind of oppression. And the third way, denigration of groups that deviate from an allegedly neutral standard often produces an internalized devaluation by members of those groups themselves. So it's not merely that you have this kind of standard of, let's say, like whiteness as the default or whatever. It's not just that you have, minority groups that are going to be deprivileged, but it's also the case that even within those groups, they view themselves inferiorly. She says, when there is an ideal of general human standards according to which everyone should be evaluated equally, then Puerto Ricans or Chinese Americans are ashamed of their accents or their parents. Black children despise the female-dominated kith and kin networks of their neighborhoods, and feminists seek to root out their tendency to cry or to feel compassion for a frustrated stranger. She considers an objection. Someone from the assimilationist bent could say, well, okay, yes, there clearly is a kind of assimilationism that is unjust, that seeks to get rid of any kind of contributions people from non-dominant groups have to offer. So you can say there's like the conformist kind of assimilationism that says that status quo institutions and norms are assumed as given, and disadvantaged groups who differ from those norms are just simply expected to conform to them, not taking into account, historical influences. The better assimilationist ideal that she thinks Wasserstrom actually is a proponent of, this transformational assimilationist ideal, says that achieving assimilation requires altering many institutions and practices in accordance with neutral rules that truly do not disadvantage or stigmatize any person, so that group membership really is irrelevant to how persons are treated. So this transformational assimilationist would say, well, we don't want to just keep kind of the ideals the same, because those ideals were created based on, racist or sexist or classist legacy. Instead, we want a new ideal that takes into account what all different kinds of groups have to offer, and that in the end, then, that new ideal will be neutral with respect to everyone. But Young's response to this is that both kind of assimilationist ideals, both the conformist and the transformational, they still deny that group difference can be positive and desirable. And so they have this idea that constructing group difference is a liability or a disadvantage. And Young, again, wants to show in those cases that she offered about black beauty or specific kinds of things that are celebrating what it means to be a woman, that those can still be positive kinds of difference that should be affirmed and respected. There's also a further question about solidarity in terms of tactics, that it might seem in certain cases the transformational approach might be, practically more successful insofar as it maybe is able to, let's say, like build a coalition among different groups to overcome systems of oppression and domination. It would seem like the politics of difference then can't build that kind of solidarity. But she says the politics of difference is certainly not against coalition, nor does it hold that, for example. Whites should not work against racial injustice or men against sexist injustice. This politics of group assertion, however, takes as a basic principle that members of oppressed groups need separate organizations that exclude others, especially those from more privileged groups. Separate organization is probably necessary in order for these groups to discover and reinforce the positivity of their specific experience, to collapse and eliminate double consciousness. So think about in the case of unions. Would it make sense that in a union there's also the representation of the boss in a union? Or should it be the case that workers have a separate organization, a union, that then kind of tries to use their power and leverage to transform their conditions? In the same way, she's saying, well, just real quick, actually, with unions, it can still be the case that you can have a boss that is friendly and on good terms with unions and wants the best conditions for their workers. But you still need the workers ultimately, she's going to argue, to have their own space where they can see what exactly their own unique experience is as a worker compared to the boss, and then what they are going to bring to the table in negotiations. So in the same way, she can say, whites can work together with blacks or other groups against racial injustice, but you still need, those people who receive the greatest effects from that injustice to have the greatest say in how to address that injustice. So it's a kind of rainbow coalition, in a sense, that she's offering. Now, won't admission that oppressed groups are different justify new forms of subordination? Couldn't, let's say, neo-Nazis or whatever, or white nationalists say, well, look, these politics of difference people are saying that, there is a difference among social groups, among blacks and whites and men and women and so on. So they're admitting that there are differences. That means we should actually structure society based on these differences, or maybe keep people separate. But what Young is going to say is that understanding of group difference is defined as a kind of absolute otherness, as mutual exclusion or categorical opposition. She calls this the logic of identity, which sees differences as exclusive of the other. But what she's arguing for is what she calls a kind of relational difference. So group difference is not essentialist, but contextual in its specificity, variation, and heterogeneity. That difference is not a priori, it's not innate, it's not given, it's actually socially constructed. That what it means to be black, or what it means to be white, what it means to be a woman or a man, all of these kinds of things are actually a matter of social contexts, material circumstances, relations between persons. And that one can actually have many different kinds of identities due to the different contexts they exist in. Such that in one case, someone in Guatemala might be seen as white in comparison to other Guatemalans, and in the United States, they might be seen as less white compared to other white people in the United States. That it's not like you just are white, or you are black, or you're mixed. It's a matter of the context in which you exist in relation to others. She says, the politics of difference confronts this fear that admission that oppressed groups are different. So the politics of difference confronts this fear and aims for an understanding of group difference as indeed ambiguous, as relational, as shifting, without clear borders that keep people straight, as entailing neither amorphous unity nor pure individuality. By asserting a positive meaning for their own identity, oppressed groups seek to seize the power of naming difference itself and explode the implicit definition of difference as deviance in relation to a norm, which freezes some groups into a self-enclosed nature. Difference now comes to mean not otherness, not exclusive opposition, but specificity, variation, and heterogeneity. In the relational understanding, the meaning of group difference also becomes contextualized. Difference no longer implies that groups lie outside one another. To say there are differences among groups does not imply that there are not overlapping experiences or that two groups have nothing in common. It's just you take into account the way that actually the effects produced by social practices, by social relations, are real. They are material effects that we feel, that we live, and we take that into account. But that doesn't mean people should be treated unequally. So she argues a goal of social justice is social equality. What exactly does that mean? Social equality means the full participation and inclusion of everyone in a society's major institutions, and the socially supported substantive opportunity for all to develop and exercise their capacities and realize their choices. So she offers three kind of examples of group conscious social policies that enable social equality. So first, are women's interests best promoted through gender-neutral or group-conscious rules and policies? She says, advocates of an equal treatment approach to pregnancy argue that women's interests are best served by vigorously pressing for the inclusion of pregnancy leaves and benefits within gender-neutral leave and benefit policies relevant to any physical condition that renders men or women unable to work. Right? So this idea that, this idea of let's say like maternity leave, it should just be a kind of leave that's offered to anyone who's unable to work, a kind of just universal leave. But she says, in my view, an equal treatment approach to pregnancy and childbirth is inadequate because it either implies that women do not have any right to leave and job security when having babies, or assimilates such guarantees under the supposedly gender-neutral category of disability. Such assimilation is unacceptable because pregnancy and childbirth are usually normal conditions of normal women, because pregnancy and childbirth themselves count as socially necessary work, and because they have unique and variable characteristics and needs. At issue is more than eliminating the disadvantage women suffer because of male models of uninterrupted work. It is also a question of establishing and confirming positive public recognition of the social contribution of childbearing. Such recognition can and should be given without either reducing women to childbearers or suggesting that all women ought to bear children and are lacking if they do not. So in this case, the best kind of social policy would not be a kind of just neutral disability leave that when women give birth, they can then take, but instead specific maternity leave that is focused on the experience of what it means and the social kind of positive role that childbirth and childbearing gives to society. Okay. Secondly, is social unity best promoted through a universal language or heterogeneity? So she says, many English-only advocates justify their position as another of many measures that should be taken to cut the costs of government. But the movement's primary appeal is to a normative ideal of the unity of polity. As a nation, the United States was founded by English speakers, non-English speakers. This is, what the kind of argument is by those who argue for English only. So as a nation, the United States was founded by English speakers. Non-English speakers are not real Americans, no matter how many generations they can trace on American soil. A polity cannot sustain itself without significant commonality and mutual identification among its citizens, this argument goes. And common language is one of the most important of such unifying forces. Linguistic and cultural pluralism leads to conflict, divisiveness, factionalism, and ultimately disintegration. Giving public preference to English supports this unity and encourages non-English speakers to assimilate more quickly. Now she says, there are at least three arguments against this appeal to the unity of a single harmonious polity. First, it is simply unrealistic. From its beginning, the United States has always harbored sizable linguistic and cultural minorities. Its history of imperialism and annexation and its immigration policy have resulted in more. So it's just false to argue that, the United States was founded by English speakers, or that it's really the English that have been here the longest, English-speaking people. Second, as I have already argued at several points, this norm of the homogeneous public is oppressive. Not only does it put unassimilated persons and groups at a severe disadvantage in the competition for scarce positions and resources, but it requires that persons transform their sense of identity in order to assimilate, right? It means that, you can no longer celebrate kind of your heritage or things like that, where you come from. You have to deny all that about you and take on this new identity. which is oppressive. Third, the normative ideal of the homogeneous public does not succeed in its stated aim of creating a harmonious nation. In group differentiated societies, conflict, factionalism, divisiveness, civil warfare do often occur between groups. But the primary cause of such conflict, however, is not group difference per se, but rather the relations of domination and oppression between groups that produce resentment, hostility, and resistance among the oppressed. So the reason, for example, that there might be issues between races in a given society is not just because inherently, different races can't get along, but it's through the decision-making procedures that different races are involved that then means some have domination over others, and that produces conflict. So again, it's a matter of decision-making procedures. Finally, are American Indians' freedom and equality best realized through assimilationism or group-conscious policies of particular rights? So she says, American Indians are the most invisible oppressed group in the United States. This was in 1990, numbering just over 1 million. They are too small a proportion of most regional populations to organize influential pressure groups or threaten major disruptions of the lives of white society. Federal and state policy often can safely ignore Indian interests and desires. Many Indians live on reservations, where non-Indians have little contact with them. Even in cities, Indians often form their own support systems and networks, mingling little with non-Indians. Whether on or off the reservation, Indians suffer the most serious marginalization and deprivation of any social group. By every measure, income, unemployment rates, infant mortality, and so on, Indians are the poorest Americans. At the same time, Indians are the most legally differentiated people in the United States, the only group granted formal special status and rights by the federal government. So she says, the case of American Indians especially exemplifies the arguments of this chapter because it is perhaps clearest here that justice toward groups requires special rights and that an assimilationist ideal amounts to genocide, quite literally in the case of the Trail of Tears, the movement that of the Cherokee from the Chattanooga area west. Such special rights, however, should not justify exclusion from full participation in the American dream of liberty, equal opportunity, and the like. Many Indians believe this system of particular rights remains too much at the discretion of the federal government, and some have taken their claims for greater self-determination to international judicial bodies. So, for example, there's been a lot of protests in the past few years as to having pipelines and things like that built through Indian land. So this is a case where they're not having their voice heard. Justice in the form of unambiguous recognition of American Indian groups as full and equal members of American society requires, in my view, that the U.S. government relinquish the absolute power to alter or eliminate Indian rights. Even in the absence of full justice, the case of Indians provides an important example of the combination of both general rights, so being an American citizen, all the rights that are bestowed onto them as being an American citizen, but also particular rights, which, I have argued, is necessary for the equality of many oppressed or disadvantaged groups. She says, I do not wish to argue that the system of particular rights or the bureaucratic form it takes should extend to other oppressed or disadvantaged social groups. The specificity of each group requires a specific set of rights for each, and for some, a more comprehensive system than for others. So maybe for, Native Americans, American Indians, they have a particular set of rights that wouldn't work for maybe, Latinos or women or things like that. Nonetheless, the case of American Indians, however, illustrates the fact that there is a precedent for a system of particular rights that a group wants for reasons of justice, namely because they enforce the group's autonomy and protect its interests as an oppressed minority. A democratic public should provide mechanisms for the effective recognition and representation of the distinct voices and perspectives of those of its constituent groups that are oppressed or disadvantaged. So there should be a way in which those distinctive voices can be heard, can be taken into account in a public democratic setting. Such group representation implies institutional mechanisms and public resources that should support, first, self-organization of group members so that they can achieve collective empowerment and a reflective understanding of their collective experience and interests in the context of the society. Second, group analysis and group generation of policy proposals in institutionalized contexts where decision makers are obliged to show that their deliberations have taken group perspectives into consideration. And third, group veto power regarding specific policies that affect a group directly. For example, let's say if Native Americans had the veto power to say, we don't want a pipeline going through our land that is going to contaminate, our drinking water. She offers those such as reproductive rights policy for women or land use policy for Indian reservations. I think it's worth asking, though, is it true that all kinds of injustice are best overcome through non-assimilationist policies? Or to what extent should we question certain kinds of injustice? In the case of, with the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Here I have a picture of black men holding up a sign, I am a man, from the Civil Rights Movement, saying, look, I am a man just as any other man, a white man or otherwise. I need equal rights. I deserve equal rights as a man. And the question is, this appeal to a kind of universal rights, does that work for all kinds of liberatory movements? I'm thinking of, again, the case of Black Lives Matter. Or even think of the case of the rainbow flag that's meant to be supportive of LGBTQ issues. Well, that flag was changed. You had then transgender kind of specific, like a V on the side, different colors added to it. Because this idea that, that kind of universalist claim of the rainbow for the pride flag maybe didn't take into account the specificity of transgender issues. And so you had to have that particular view added. So there are questions as to whether, for example, the I am a man sign works just for black men. Does it work for all black individuals? Is that idea of I am a man that kind of appeal to universal rights? Can that work for any kind of a movement? Or do you need particularist kind of slogans, particularist kind of demands for particular issues for it to best be successful in overcoming issues of domination and oppression?